Welcome to this video on the Contax RX camera. The Contax RX was an automatic exposure camera using full program and aperture and shutter speed priority modes with manual override, aimed at the amateur market. It is a manual focus camera that has centre weighted and spot metering. It takes lenses of the Contax Yashica line, made by Carl Zeiss, Yashica and other manufacturers. The RX was one of the last of the Contax 35mm manual focus film cameras. There was also a simplified RX2 version produced. Introduced in 1994, the camera has a built-in motor drive for film advance and rewind. The film speed range is 6 to 6400 ASA in 1/3 of a stop increments, and also DX coding support over the range of 25 to 5000 ASA. Metering is centre weighted or spot metering. The range of shutter speeds is from 4 seconds to 1/4000th of a second in manual and shutter speed priority modes, and from 16 seconds to 1/4000th of a second in aperture priority and program modes. The shutter speeds are quartz controlled and stepless. Shutter flash sync is 1/125th of a second. An electronic cable release can be attached to a custom socket. There is also a depth of field preview button. Multiple exposures are supported. Interchangeable focusing screens are supported on this camera. Exposure compensation of plus or minus 2 stops is available in 1/3 of a stop increments. TTR flash with Contax flash units is supported. Automatic exposure bracketing is available up to plus or minus 1 stop in 1/2 stop increments. The main controls on the Contax RX are the on-off switch, which also incorporates the AE lock and shutter release, the display panel with the exposure counter, and optionally an indication of whether the camera is using DX film speed reading and a low battery state indication. The up button, the down button, the drive mode dial, the metering type selection lever, the exposure compensation dial, the ABC mode lever, a diopter adjustment wheel, the flash hot shoe with TTL connector pins, the shutter speed dial, the camera mode selector lever. On the back of the camera are cable release socket, the film rewind lever, the viewfinder cover, the viewfinder blind switch, the camera mode lever release button, the data back buttons, the data back battery compartment, the socket for the external battery pack. On the front of the camera are the lens release at the top of the lens mount, the exposure check button, the depth of field preview button at the bottom of the lens mount, electronic self-timer LED in the grip, PC sync port, the film back door release catch. On the bottom of the camera is a tripod socket, and the battery compartment cover release screw. The camera takes a 2CR5 battery. The main power switch has the shutter release in the middle of it. The power switch goes from off to on to AEL for auto exposure lock, which saves the currently metered exposure value. The shutter speed is set by rotating the shutter speed wheel. The ISO rating is set by using the camera mode lever to select ISO mode, and then using the up and down buttons to select the desired ISO value, or DX for setting the film speed automatically for DX coded film. The ISO value is set by moving the camera mode lever out of ISO setting mode. In automatic modes, exposure compensation is set by rotating the exposure compensation dial. Compensation ranges plus or minus 2 stops in 1/3 of a stop increments. The film is rewound using the film rewind lever on the back of the camera. The camera supports 5 different camera modes. Program mode, where the camera sets both aperture and shutter speed. AV or aperture priority, where the aperture is set on the lens and the camera sets the appropriate shutter speed. TV mode or shutter speed priority, where the shutter speed is set on the shutter speed dial and the camera sets the aperture. In both TV and program modes, the aperture is set to the minimum value using an lens and the camera sets the appropriate lens aperture. Shutter speed priority and program modes only work with lenses, which have the minimum aperture marked in green to match the green of the P and TV on the mode dial. M mode is for manual exposure mode, where you set both the aperture and shutter speed. X mode is for flash sync at 1/125th of a second. And B mode is used for long exposures. The modes are selected by pushing in the mode lever release lock on the back of the camera and rotating the camera mode lever to the desired mode, while keeping the mode lever release lock pressed down. The drive mode dial enables you to select single frame advance, continuous advance, or multiple exposure mode. The camera also has an electronic self-timer supporting a 10-second delay. The desired mode is selected by lifting up the mode dial and rotating it to the desired setting and releasing the dial back down. The green setting on the dial is single shooting with DFI in focus mode rather than depth mode, although the behaviour of the DFI in this mode can be changed using the custom functions. In multiple exposure mode, the drive mode dial remains in a raised position, and the camera will not take pictures until a number of exposures is specified using the up and or down buttons, and the camera is switched into another drive mode. The specified number of multiple exposures can then be taken. Multiple exposure mode can be cancelled by setting the number of multiple exposures back to 0. An external power pack, P8, can be plugged into the socket on the back of the camera. A Contax diopter lens can be mounted in the viewfinder cover. The ABC mode enables a series of 3 exposures to be taken, one at the set exposure value and one each above and below the metered value by the exposure bracket value. The bracket is set using the dial. 3 frames at 0.5 stops bracket. 3 frames at 1 stop bracket. The metering mode is selected by rotating the metering mode switch. The modes are center weighted and spot. The cable release socket is used to connect a Contax cable release and other compatible accessories. The Contax RX uses the Contax cable release S or cable release L type cable releases. There is a PC sync port for use with a flash that doesn't use a hot shoe. You have to ensure the shutter speed is 1/125th of a second or lower. The built-in data back supports printing either the date or the time between frames on the film. The camera supports TTL flash metering with Contax flashes. The RX is compatible with later Contax flashes in TTL mode, although it will not support all of the features of the TLA360. Although second curtain sync is supported, auto setting of the film speed and aperture are also supported, as is flash unit light compensation. A flash can be connected using either the PC sync port or the hot shoe. TTL flash only works via the hot shoe connector. In automatic mode with a Contax flash attached that supports TTL metering, the camera automatically switches to 1/125th of a second flash sync speed. Sometimes a lower flash sync speed is set depending on the camera mode. The viewfinder illustration from the brochure is shown here. The viewfinder displays the shutter speed with over and under exposure indications. The aperture value currently set on the lens is displayed, along with the metering mode. There is also an indication of when exposure compensation is in use, and a flash ready indication which also doubles as a flash confidence indication. The frame number is also displayed, or other information such as the time left on the self-timer. There is also the display of the digital focus indication in the centre of the viewfinder. The DFI indication has two modes, focus mode and depth mode. In focus mode, a series of rectangles are displayed either to the left or right of the centre point to indicate front or back focusing. In depth mode, a second line of dashes is included to show you what aperture you have set on the lens, to give you a vague indication of the depth of field available, although this does not seem to factor in the focal length of the lens. Contax described the RX as a machine that maximises the bond between artist and tool. The Contax RX is noted for having a very quiet shutter. It is not a light camera. The Contax RX introduced the digital focus indication, although this was apparently dropped from the RX2. This is an attempt to make focusing more accurate and supplied feedback on focus point in the context of the depth of field of the image. The DFI tends to lie quite badly behind the movement of the focusing ring, and it uses a very limited area of the viewfinder, incorporating the split screen line to determine the focus point, which can make it awkward to use reliably. It also seems only to factor in the aperture when generating its depth of field indication. This renders it somewhat limited. The focus indication seems accurate when it works, and can be useful to confirm accurate focusing in situations where time is available. This was an interesting idea, although how much people used it in practice I do not know. I suspect that it would have been more useful on the autofocus SLRs where the focal length of the lens in use would have been available, but it was not used on the Contax autofocus SLRs. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the DFI was a bit of a gimmick, as in most scenarios it doesn't seem to be any better than using the focusing screen, and it tends to be slower. The depth of field mode seems to be of limited use as it doesn't consider the focal length of a lens in use, as the camera body does not have this information, and it tends not to agree with the depth of focus scales on the lenses. The viewfinder gives consistent focusing with an f1.4 lens from near and far. The Contax RX supports a magnifier or right angle finder being fitted to the viewfinder. 5 different focusing screens are available. It can also be used with the Auto Macro Bellows PC. The camera has a built-in winder. A wide range of accessories connect to the cable release socket, including infrared controllers and radio controllers. The camera also supports some custom functions which are set in a similar manner to the ISO. See the manual for further details. The RX is one of the newer Contaxes and seems quite reliable. The cameras do suffer from mirror slip. If considering buying an RX, I would look for one in good condition and consider getting it serviced.